Okay.
Okay.
All right, Julie, it's all yours.
All right. Now I have to get back into my system here. Okay. Thank you, Jay, who helped me do a dry run last week. And if it weren't for Vince Pellegrini, who we found crawling through the wildflowers down at Shanks Ferry Wildlife Preserve, David and I wouldn't know about this wonderful camera club. So it's exceedingly nice to be part of this club. And I'm going to talk to you about iPhone photography tonight, and understand that I sort of divided into the camera part of the iPhone and then the editing, post-processing, stylizing part of what the apps can give you on your iPhone or your iPad, which means you can then download all your other digital images from your big DSLRs and do the same kind of editing on an iPad that you're going to see tonight in the iPhone presentation. This is sort of an homage to my father, who was an amateur photographer and loved to keep his Nikons, Leicas, and Hasselblads in the trunk of his Ford. And he was more than willing to let me use all his cameras, but I wasn't that interested back then. And when I was early married, I always had lovely equipment, but I never read a manual. So I was teaching by the seat of my, or I was photographing by the seat of my pants all through the early part of my photography experience. And we were living in Connecticut at the end of the century, 98, 99. And we were a family of 5, and we lost our oldest child to leukemia as he was about to go back to his senior year in college. And that was a devastating tragedy for all of us. And in our healing and grief process, I started taking photography classes at a local art school, printed in the wet dark room, and just started shooting with my camera because that was part of my healing. And for a while, I was a garden photographer in New Canaan, Connecticut, shooting these beautiful, beautiful gardens whenever I wanted to go in and photograph them. And that became a family photography business. And then I decided that I wanted to shoot weddings because it was edgy, it was formulaic, I loved the emotion, and I thought it would be great fun, but it was really hard work. And I did that for 10 years. And in 2012, David was taking a workshop up at the Center for Contemporary Photography in Woodstock. And he said, why don't you come with me? And I said, well, what am I going to take? And he said, well, you could take an iPhone class with Dan Burkholder. And that's what I did. And I was awake almost all night saying, David, you have to look at what this little camera will do. And that was the beginning of my journey as an iPhone photographer. And I still love my Fuji X-T4. I still love my Olympus EM2, but the iPhone's what I always have with me. So can you see this screen? Is that clear to all of you?
Yes.
So I'm not going to read this to you, but read the comments on the white screen that we've all heard about why the iPhone just isn't as good as my Nikon, my Sony, my whatever, big DSLR. Well, I'm here to say that you used to have to say when you were hanging a print on a wall in an exhibit that you had shot it with an iPhone, and you don't have to do that anymore because the iPhone is so good that it will give you large prints and almost the quality that you are getting from your big professional large cameras at the expense of just sort of putting this cute little device in your back pocket and off you go. So think about, as I talk to you tonight, how easy it is to just walk out the door with your iPhone in your pocket. You may have 3 prime lenses on this iPhone if you have a current 12 or 13. It's very easy to always have with you. You can load numerous camera apps besides just the in-house camera. And then you can shoot with different kinds of effects. You can share it right there. You can airdrop back and forth with all your friends, or you can edit right there. So with the iPhone, you have this Wi-Fi connection, you have a phone, you have a camera, and you have a hard drive on which you are storing lots of different camera apps and editing apps. So this is a picture of, on the left, of a photograph that I shot very early on after I took a Dan Burkholder course. I was at a farm. To tell you the truth, I never saw that hayloft up in that top part. The camera did. And it was probably a 4 or a 5. And then the image on the right is actually a multiple exposure, and I'll explain that to you later on. Hint is I really love going to the car wash. So these images are about 10 years apart, but you can still see that there's a wonderful quality there. This is a recent photograph with an app called Photo Split. It is a camera, but it will take multiple images, and then you can run those images through different blending modes, much like Photoshop, till you get the effect that you want. Another multiple exposure. And this was with a 12, probably a year ago. It still amazes me that the colors are as vibrant as they are, the tonalities there, the sharpness is there. I'd put it up next to my XT4 every once in a while. And this has no comment. So my first introduction to the iPhone photography was with Dan Burkholder. I'm sure you all know him. You've probably taken workshops with him. The image on the left is the Norwalk Harbor, where I used to walk every day. And you can see that it's very reminiscent of what Dan was doing back then with his exposure and his editing. And that's what we all did all that one weekend up in Woodstock, and came home with a brand new camera in our back jeans pocket. And so I had this little camera with me all the time, because who leaves home without their iPhone? So I would just keep shooting different things that I saw, one of which was the morning that I opened up my compost bin on the left in 2015, and there was just this gorgeous array of composting vegetation, and it became a photograph. And for those of you who are familiar with the Marcellus Shale oil drilling up in central and northern Pennsylvania, in the summertime, I go to a small mountain town called Eaglesmere, which is in the middle of Sullivan County. And in that area and north of us was where a lot of shale drilling was taking place, much to our concern. So for a while, I put on a hard hat and went around photographing drill sites and trying to make a documentary statement about what was happening to the land. So this was probably around 2012, 2013. Now, when I teach a class, I teach in real time so that on a TV screen or a big screen, you will see the various camera apps and editing apps that are on my iPhone. The larger screen is pretty much the go-to apps that I always went to until I bought a 12, and now I have an iPhone 13. I will say that the in-house camera on your iPhone 13 is so good, even in low light, that you don't need some of these apps that you see on the second screen, which is what I used to use when I was shooting in low light. I will talk to you about Clone Erase, which is on that large screen at the top left, and Hipstamatic. Hipstamatic won the Apple App of the years ago, and it's been a really good app where you can dial in different film simulations and filters and get a very vintage antique look to your photographs. And slow shutter is what a lot of photographers use just to get the intermittent camera movement and slow down the shutter, keep it open longer so you get a blurred effect. But you can see how many cameras I already have on this one little device. On my home screen, my Apple camera is always in the bottom trough. And you'll see at the bottom of all those different apps, an app called Snapseed, which is pretty much the universally accepted editing app if you want to go beyond your Apple phone edit features. And it is just incredibly user-friendly. I teach it in the class. You end up taking a drab photograph to something that's really outstanding, and you want to print it and you want to share it. Photo Split is that app that I referred to just earlier about shooting multiple images. So this is Hipstamatic. Where I live in the summertime is a really old town. They called it the town that time forgot in the Washington Post years ago. So I would go around shooting with my Hipstamatic app camera on my iPhone. And I would get these very vintage looking images that I absolutely loved because it sort of blended in with the atmosphere of the town. And in 2012, David and I went to Istanbul. Now I'm shooting with a 5S. I'm using the Hipstamatic app that you can see in the lower left-hand corner. And we hire a professional photographer to take us to places in Istanbul that you wouldn't normally go. So he's there on the right, and I'm playing with a panoramic view app camera in this 5S. And the part about this experience was that as we hobbled up these stone steps of varying heights to get to this rooftop, he opens up the door to this beautiful scene of the whole city and says, just be sure you stay at the peak of the roof, because I brought somebody up here last week and I went down to the edge of the roof and fell through the roof. So it's one of those moments when you're like, do I really want to be here? But it was fantastic. This is from Cuba. This is with the 5S. Again, you can see with the Hipstamatic camera, you can dial in what kind of effect you want to have on the image that you're about to take. And the nice thing about it is that you will have the original image and you will also have the Hipstamatic effect. So I shot at cafes. You go down to Kathy's Cafe and you're sitting there seeing all these retro pieces of my history from the 50s and the 60s. And you would take something as simple as what you see on the left and then go and edit in Snapseed or some other editing feature and end up with something like the image on the right. This was at Kathy's as well, but I used an app that made it look almost like it was a photograph, but it had some pen and ink over top of it. And then in 2014, we went to Sydney, and anybody can shoot that Sydney Opera House, but I remembered what Dan had done with some of his editing features, and I submitted this image on the right to some competition out on Long Island, and that was accepted. So the iPhone was beginning to be accepted as a legitimate camera way back in 2014. We're out on a hike in Eaglesmere. I rarely ever go out with a dead battery, but I turned on the Olympus, the battery was dead, and I was like, I don't have a camera. Oh, yes, I do. It's in my back pocket. So these were images of this hike. There are 4 little kids there. Remember this image because there'll be something later on that I'll refer to, but what I want you to recognize is that a portrait and an evocative photograph doesn't have to show the faces. And because we were so messy and muddy, I added a little bit of this to this photograph, and that's how it ended up being printed. And then I also travel, I think I missed, there we go. As with anything that I think we photographers are experimenting, like in Lightroom, if you want to see where the contrast is, you run the slider the whole way up to the right or the whole way down to the left. I sort of got involved in some pretty heavy editing. I would certainly admit now that that image on the right is not something I want to print, but I remember how beautiful the reflections were on that wet street and how easily the iPhone lens could pick that up. And then when I traveled, I would shoot with my EM1 or my EM2, and I would go back and I would always edit in Snapseed. So you can see what I did in Snapseed to bring out the highlights and some of the contrast in this picture of Trafalgar Square. And if you're in a cafe and you need to go use the ladies' room, and you have your iPhone in your back pocket and you happen to look out the window, that's what you see. So I took one image and then I took another image this might have been in Vivid HDR, which was a wonderful camera app back when we were in London. But you can see the difference in how the details come out and the shadows and the highlights are contrasted. It's just an iPhone, folks. But look how powerful it is. Again, the moody Hipstamatic, Grand Central Terminal. And then there was a wedding in Eaglesmere, and I knew it was going to be this very romantic backyard. You can see everybody's dressed in white. And I knew that the Hipstamatic app was going to give me the images that I wanted. So that's the bride and her dad dancing, and then with the bride dancing with her husband. And it just worked for the mood of that day. This is a High Line in New York City. And I don't know if you do this, but I often see groups where one person is odd man out because they have to take the picture and everybody's lining up for the photograph. And I'll usually go up and say, do you want me to take this for you? And then you can all be in it. They say, yes, thanks very much. And this is what these girls were taking, where the foreground is totally in shadow. So I explained to them that on your iPhone, if you tap with your finger where you want the camera to expose for the light, and focus, you get a yellow box, and beside it is a slider. So if you want to increase the light or decrease the light where that box is evaluating, you can do that. So they went home very happy. So I've used my iPhone camera with different camera apps and editing apps. Vivid HDR, as I mentioned earlier, was a phenomenal HDR camera app, and it was discontinued. But I know a lot of people before the sophistication of the 12 and the 13 phones were shooting with several different camera apps and still going to editing with Snapseed. Now, this is a double exposure that I think I took in Snapseed. So I would have brought in one image, and then one of the options that you have in the editing modes of Snapseed is to make a double exposure. So I did that. I was looking at trying to make multiple images a number of years ago. The image on the right is with Photo Split, which was done this fall. Much more easily done because it was all in camera. It wasn't in an editing setup. I don't know how many of you use portrait mode. You need two lenses, I believe, to be able to pull off portrait mode, where the camera will take the subject and then another background image, and then you can set different light modes. And this was the butcher in Westport. He's part of my Red Glass project. Another checker, but the red glasses are great. And this is all in camera editing. When you shoot in portrait mode, you can spin through different lighting possibilities before you save the image. And with a little bit of effort, you can do the same thing in portrait mode with florals. Fast forward to Asheville. There are three of us out walking around what we thought was a deserted barn. And down in the holler, we see some people. So we decided we'd go down and talk to them, but we're greeted by three really scary dogs. I thought one of them was going to attack us, but somehow we made it to this woman. And I have my Olympus hanging over around my neck with, I think, some sort of long lens. And I'm thinking, if I ask to photograph her, she will not give me the composure and the expression and the emotion that I'm looking for. So I just asked her if I could photograph her with my iPhone, and that was fine with her because look what she has in her hand. So I shot her several times. And then I decided her husband ought to be in the photograph too. And so I asked him to pose, and that is a portrait mode shot. I kind of think he looks a little bit like George Clooney with dirty hands. And I can't hear you, but I hope you're laughing. Questions? Do we want to keep going, or are there some questions people have?
I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I have a question about doing street photography. I've been told that the smaller the camera that you have, the better chance you have of getting, what's the word, where people aren't posing, just off the hip kind of shots or whatever. Or if you do want to ask them for permission, that it's much easier to get somebody to be willing if they don't see some big lens, like you said a minute ago. So and plus having it with you all the time. So if anybody really wants to start to try to do that street photography, the phone is a great way. The second question I have, that's all, is about using flash, the LED flash that's on the phone. If you're going to do that, and I suggest you try that from time to time, try one with flash and without flash, and just see how they turn out. Don't be intimidated to try the flash.
Have you used your iPhone with the flash?
I have an Android Note 8, and I've done it both ways. And I think a lot of times the picture looks a lot smoother and nicer without the flash. The feature you mentioned about touching the screen and then brightening up right there. And I also shoot HDR, so that's hard to get good portraits with people because they move, taking multiple shots.
So do the Android users have the same box that you tap to get the exposure and the focus, and then you can slide up or down to increase or decrease the exposure compensation?
My Note 8 does, even though I'm on an older version of Android. But ironically, when you had those 3 pictures up of the girls, I pointed my camera at the screen here, and little square boxes came around the faces. And then I could do the brightness and the darkness like you were saying. I just tried it out while you had that on the screen.
Yeah. Thanks for your comments. Any other questions?
Bert asked, do you shoot RAW at all? You shoot RAW?
Are you asking me?
Yes, Bert had a question. Do you shoot RAW?
You can shoot RAW with the iPhone 13, I think maybe the 12 and the 11. I think there's an issue if you shoot RAW, you have the responsibility of doing all the editing in post-processing when you get home and load and upload your images. I personally think the technology with the Apple phones are so sophisticated that I would rather shoot in JPEG and that HEIC mode and see what the technology of the iPhone camera does, because it's so wickedly sophisticated that lots of times you don't need to do much editing at all to your images. And if you really want the RAW, shoot the JPEG and then shoot the RAW, and then you have the best of both worlds. Does that answer your question?
As far as I know, yes. Yeah, he said thank you.
Any other questions before I go on? So let's talk a little bit about editing. You have maybe 4 or 5 different camera apps that you can choose from when you're out shooting. So it's a little bit like leaving with your DSLR. Do you want to put on your wide angle lens, your macro, or your zoom lens? You do the same thing with the Apple phone. What are you going to be shooting today? Is it moody, romantic? Is it HDR? Is it multiple exposures? Those are all your camera apps. Then you can do post-processing and editing where you enhance the image or you can stylize it. And there are lots of stylizing apps on the market. And of course, I got seduced by numbers of them. One was and is Waterlog, which is an app that will change your image into a watercolor. And then the other thing you can do is take a straight photograph, which you see on the left, put it through the watercolor app. So you have a watercolor. And then in a third app called Image Blender, you can blend the photograph and the watercolor image so that you have a combination of the two. And in this image, you'll see that the foreground and the ice is actually a photograph. But as you recede into the background, it becomes a watercolor. So there are those kinds of editing and stylizing opportunities if you want to pursue those beyond just the straight image out of the camera. And if you go to falling water and you walk down this path and you get to where every single person takes the same photograph, like you see on the left, and there's a little dirt circle right where you're supposed to stand. So I shot that, and then I turned it into a waterlog, a watercolor, and then with a mask, erased the building, the watercolor impact effect on the building, so that the building became a photograph, but the surrounding greenery was a watercolor. Again, editing with Snapseed. And this is my Olympus, but I had loaded my images off the SD card into my iPad, so I edit on my iPad using Snapseed or any other of the editing apps that I have. These are along the edge of the coastline in Naples. And some of the editing apps that I'm using now, one is called Distressed FX, and you can find that in the App Store. This was just a precious little leaf with, now I'm shooting with the 10S. I thought I bought a new generation of an iPhone every other generation, but when I did the research on how often I turned in my iPhone, it was pretty much every year, I have to admit. This is with an XS 2019, and with either oilist, glaze, or brush stroke, it became this image. Now,
Hey,
is it
Julie.
overbaked, over stylized? Yes. Question?
Yeah, Julie, how much in these different apps, like Image Blender, are you able to apply different areas of the image, masks like in Lightroom or Photoshop?
Yes.
You can, okay.
You have a slider in Image Blender that allows you to adjust the effect between two layers. One would be the photograph, one would be the watercolor in the example that I showed. So you can slide back and forth to see how much of a photograph you want and how much of a watercolor you want. And then there's a mask that you can paint, reveal, or conceal the top layer or the bottom layer, just like in masking in Photoshop.
Thank you.
Okay, now, I'm not so sure we want anything quite as grandiosely colorful as this, but it does show you the capacity of these stylizing apps, oilist, glaze, and brush stroke, to give you certain stylizing effects. They can be oil color, oil paintings, watercolors, pen and ink, sort of the sky's the limit. Oilist has this wonderful sequence that is almost as pleasurable to see it create what it's going to do to your image as it is the final product. But you could take a look at it. They're all at the App Store. These two are images from Eaglesmere. I've shot them, I don't know how many times, but these are with a filter, a Distress FX filter, that gives you a little bit more texture to the sky and to the ice. David and I went to Florida in February of 2020 for 2 weeks, and we ended up staying in Florida for 3 months because of the pandemic. So I did a lot of shooting along the coastline, all with my iPhone. The 13, this is a 10S, black and white. The iPhone 13 is phenomenally good in low light. This was with the XS, and I held it on the top of a bridge to steady it while I did a long exposure. These are just images along the ice as I was walking one day. It just had a really strange texture along the edge of the rocks. And then you have the snapshots. I mean, we all take snapshots. Our photo albums are filled with snapshots. These are with a 12. Now the 12 is the same size, the 12 Pro is the same size as the 10, but it's bevel to bevel, so you have more screen capacity. And then we already talked about whether you want to shoot RAW or shoot RAW and JPEG or just JPEG. This was some sort of layered image. It might have been 3 or 4 images together. This is along the Susquehanna, and somehow the HDR kicked in, and it's way more than what I'm comfortable with as an HDR. With a little bit of editing, just back towards that horizon, you can bring out the color, saturate the clouds a little bit more, and it goes from good to great. And then I would shoot with my regular camera, edit in Snapseed, and end up with a different image. Now, if I haven't convinced you, take a look at these 2 images. Same photographer, accomplished photographer, took one shot with the iPhone X and the other photograph with my 13. Picture says 1,000 words, doesn't it? And then Jay suggested I say something about the size, how large you can print iPhone images. There was a gentleman in one of my iPhone photography classes several years ago, and he is still shooting with his iPhone, but he is now a phenomenal street photographer. We went to his photo reception recently in Norwalk. This was a 30 by 40 image from an iPhone 2016. This image he sold, which is a 4 by 5 foot copy of an iPhone capture. And then the cool thing he did was he took the portrait and created labels because his exhibit was at a distillery in Norwalk. So this is the vodka bottle with that portrait on the bottle. So now we're moving beyond the iPhone, and I'll just briefly share with you some of the projects that I keep thinking about. Since I'm a grandmother, and they call me Zafta, and there are lots of women that like Botox and fillers, and I decided it was important to age gracefully. And over the winter, I particularly love buying tulips and letting them shrivel and die. And they really are almost as beautiful as they are when they're at their peak. And these were shot on a light table. And it's ongoing. You can also freeze flowers I think it's better to freeze them in distilled water because you don't get the bubbles. But it's quite interesting to see what you get if you freeze flowers and then let them begin to melt and maybe use an auxiliary light to shine into the depths of the ice and the petals. Someone gave me a bouquet of parrot tulips, and that's how the parrot tulips died on the left, but they were exotic and organic while they were in their prime. And then I took some multiple exposures of the parrot tulips, which is what you see on the left. And in Lightroom, there was a preset that gave me that color combination. So I kept that and printed that. And then another photography friend suggested that you could create a collage of the two different images. Now, this is clearly a work in progress. I haven't had time to go back and redo it, but I think there's some possibilities there. I think you could work around that, and it could be something more than just a worksheet. And then you still have to go back to those beautiful blossoms. And what I've started doing is looking at the photos, the flowers, the florals from the back, because most people just want to shoot the blossom from the front. And often, especially with orchids, you get beautiful organic shapes from the back of the flowers. These are all from Chanticleer Gardens down near Philadelphia. Still looking at multiple images. These would have been edited in Snapseed or Hipstamatic. Changing the white balance. There's a setting on my manual shutter speed on the Olympus that will give me this effect. And I'm always looking, because I have my iPhone, I'm always looking at what I can see and what I can capture and what is different. And this was just the bottom of a sign in the retirement community where I live, but I loved the snow coming through the metal. And I took a double exposure of it and then added something to the background and ended up with this image. I also have a mannequin project, and the hand drawing was on the food truck of the coffee shop, of the coffee vendor on the New Jersey Turnpike. And that became that. I'll let you decide what this is. It can be eerie. You can tell whatever story you want. It was in the middle of the woods. It could be enchanting or scary, but the whole purpose of the photograph is for the viewer to be able to tell their own story. And in presentations, I learned from a woman who I studied with for several years that when you do a sequence, you have to have a comma. So this is one of my commas. I don't know how I decided to combine these three. I think it's the shapes. One is from Corning Glassworks on the left. The middle one is just a sconce on a dining room wall. And the third was just this hanging model in a store where I was buying something. But it works for me. It tells a story. And now I'm going to play for you a very short video called Down the Drain when we were stuck in Naples. We needed projects, and one of my projects was along the edge, which was along the edge of the surf, but there was this sink in the apartment where we were that had the most beautiful reflectance. It was like a soft box. And David or I would cut up the vegetables and they'd sort of accumulate there. And I thought, that's a project. So this is what it became. Oh, no, wait, I think we're going to be able to play it. Oh, maybe not. Sorry, I guess that's not going to come through. Maybe I can do that while we're talking, okay? So new experiments, explorations, projects. These are new ideas that I have. I don't know how many of you know about ICM, intermittent camera movement. There's a magazine, digital subscription online that you can subscribe to, but it's when you move your camera and you slow down the shutter and you get different kinds of movements. There are a lot of people that are photographing trees and these incredible birches or sycamore trees that are really iridescent in silver, and they're using ICM to emphasize that. This was on the beach in Naples at night, where there was I think it was an Indian family that had a lot of saris and colorful clothes on. So I was just trying to see what it was like to slow down the shutter and get a little bit of the movement of what they were doing. This was the water that night. And then there was a family that was their last night on the beach. And there was just this tender moment between the mother and father while the kids were playing in the sand. And the thing that I noticed after I took it was that there, as Sam Abel said, you always want to have spaces between people. And other than the couple embracing and the little girl with her head leaning down, there's space between all the subjects in that image, so that lends to a better capture in the end. Couple more brief florals, more dead flowers, a snapshot, because I love the peonies, but I ended up editing them so they would look like this. And this is my ballerina fuchsia, but I put some sort of texture in the backgrounds, so there was a difference between the blossom and the background, so it created more depth. And then you can do crazy things like this. This was photo split, took these 3 images and then edited it with the blending modes, and you get these strange abstracts, some of which you can use, some of which are just fun, but you think, wow, and it's out of my iPhone. So I'd like to introduce you to Legless. She's a mannequin that I bought when a store was closing in Eaglesmere, and my project this summer was to dress her up and take her to different places that were sort of oxymoronic and photograph her. So I have to give back the beautiful negligee nightgown, so I'm gonna have to find a new outfit for her. But my vision was to take her down by the lake on some misty morning with the clouds rolling in and photograph her down there. I'm always thinking outside the box. This is one of the first layered images I did. We were in Harper's Ferry, and rather than photograph the trestle, I did a multiple exposure of the trestle. And so this is my Harper's Ferry Railway trestle. Now, remember I told you about the car wash? I love going to the car wash because you sit in your car and you get your iPhone out and you start photographing the water on your windshield, because then you can use it as a double exposure on some of your other photographs. There's a method to my madness. These were just multiple images stacked on one another. If I look at this, I'm pretty sure there's a car wash file there. I've started looking beneath the surface. You know, when they say a good photographer keeps going back to the same place time after time after time to see if they can make a photograph that is different than all the others. So I walk along this outlet pond and this lake looking beneath the surface, trying to decide what should be included beneath the water and what needs to stay on the top. This was the original image, a multiple exposure of a beautiful willow tree down along the outlet pond. And I've edited it so that it looks like this and printed it. Came out very nicely. This I know is a multiple exposure from photo split taken earlier this fall. Get really good tonalities using the blending modes with that app. And then Vince and I went to Lenox, Massachusetts to study a 3-day workshop with Valda Bailey and Doug Chinnery. And it was phenomenal, where you take multiple exposures in camera. You can change the white balance of one exposure, change the white balance again, and the next exposure, so you have these different hues in a capture like this. These are experiments. These were early. This was where I took an image with the Kelvin up to probably 9,000, and then took another image with the Kelvin white balance down around 2,800. This kind of looks to you, I'm sure, like two columns surrounded by a bunch of flowers. But what it started out with was that path with two columns and nothing more. And I knew that if I took multiple exposures of different clusters of flowers, I could build something so that it looked like this. There were hands in one of the buildings where we were. So this would have been a study of the hands with the white balance down into the blue setting. And this would have been with the white balance up closer to the higher Kelvin, where you get the warm tones. Believe it or not, this is an intermittent camera movement image of a dragon. So it's clearly abstract. It's not It's not an image of something, it's an image about something. And that's what Vince and I were working on, is not just so much the straight, realistic representation that we all love as a landscape or a portrait, but making it more about that object that maybe becomes unrecognizable. We're almost finished, folks. Then we can ask questions. These were some final thoughts after that workshop. I learned a new word. I don't even think it's an SAT word, pareidolia, seeing what isn't there. And some photographers see what you and I might just walk by and totally disregard, looking for something else. But it's a little bit like working at the edge of an on thought, or seeing what people don't see. And I loved what Doug said when he said, make a photograph of something, not a photograph of something, but an image about something. And it doesn't, abstracts don't excuse a photographer from considering the artistic principles of photography, because we still have certain rules that are good to follow and break if necessary, but good to remember that those are there. And abstracts allow the viewer to make his or her own story. And finally, I just want to share with you why we make pictures. This was last November. The kids wanted me to do their Christmas card, so I set up both families. And then I wanted to get a final photograph of all of us together. So this is all of us with the Olympus on a tripod, and my son-in-law in the white shirt has my iPhone in his hand on the Olympus remote, triggering the shutter. And it was one of the best photographs of the whole day, but he could just click away, and we're looking at the camera and nobody's there to snap it. Remember, I told you about clone erase? This is really fun if you have kids, grandkids, or you have spirited parties, where you can see what I've done. I've taken them in different positions, and then the camera just creates a composite, and they love doing this. And then you go on a hike, and the kids tell the grandmother that it's only 1 or 2 miles, and it ends up being 5 miles, and we're really, really hot. And everybody's waiting around in the creek. So we took off Nova's clothes, sat her on these black rocks, and I got some of these. That's why I make photographs. And then remember earlier on, I showed you the image of the little girl with braids and the little boy with his arm around her. This isn't my image, it's one that my daughter took, but it speaks so much to me about the tenderness and the love between those two. And I don't even need to see their faces. Where I live in this retirement community, I submitted this image as part of a display to be hung, and the guy making the decisions called and said, I really love this photograph, Julie, but if we hang it, there are going to be some people that are going to be really offended. And I was like, okay, I don't get that. How could you be offended by that? But you have to follow the rules. So Nova didn't get hung like that. And this is the last one, and this is why I make photographs. The little girl on the left is 6 years old back in 1980. Little white dress, little straw hat. And the 2 girls on the right are her daughters 30 years later. And that's going to be there for a long time. And that warms my heart to think that we have that history and that we'll have those images framed in our cottage for a long time. So I am finished, and I thank you all for turning out tonight, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Julie, when you went to,
Comment.
Julie, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
When you went to the Bailey and Chinnery workshop, were people using all kinds of different cameras?
Yes,
Okay.
Bailey and Chinnery use Canons because Canon really has the most sophisticated options to do multiple exposures and rapid high-speed stacking of photographs. I was using an X-T4, so I could do multiple exposures. Other people were using Nikons. But the go-to for Bailey and Chinnery is the Canon, and they use one long lens. They don't carry around a lot of equipment.
You can also stop sharing. I guess you are doing that.
Yeah, I can stop sharing. Oh, I can see people. Ooh. Oh, nice to see all of you.
Ask away, everybody. What questions do you have for Julie?
What do you do with your iPhones? Do you take lots of images and edit them and print them, or do you mostly just send them to family in shared albums?
Well, I post a lot of things to my family through Facebook and other social media. I very rarely print. I started back in 1976 and used to print back then, but don't really do it much now.
Well, do you print with your regular camera?
No,
I mean, do you print with
actually, very seldom. Actually, it's not hard copy or print medium. I think is beautiful, and I wish I did do more. I think maybe more or less a cost thing, I guess. I mean, it's not really that expensive to print, but I don't know. I just find it so much simpler. As you said, if you're shooting with a phone, boom, you share it for the phone, and the images are phone screen type of quality, and you can print, but I don't really do it. Does anybody else print?
Not as
So
much.
something,
Like.
go ahead, Jay.
I hope to get into more printing. Those larger prints that you shared, just is amazing what you can do with with an iPhone photo. You don't think you can make them big, but they look pretty good to me.
When we went to Butch's reception, there was probably a 30 by 40 print hanging. And when something's that big, it's printed and you're meant to look at it from a distance. You aren't supposed to go up and sort of investigate whether it's pixelated or not. But I did that, and it was tack sharp. It was incredible. And I think he went to Cuba with an iPhone 8, and he's still printing and selling those Cuban portraits.
Wow.
Yeah, I just wondered what app you use for slow shutter speed on the phone.
I use Slow Shutter.
It's called
which
slow
is
shutter.
in-
Okay.
It's called Slow Shutter. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I only
if I
shoot
could-
on my. I'm sorry. I only shoot on my phone. I gave up with my camera. It's much lighter, and like you said, always with me. I edit in Snapseed, and I print and hang and frame everything. So, it's fun.
How large are you
What
printing?
I
iPhone
print
do you have?
13 by 19.
Yeah,
At least on my own. On my own, I can probably print larger.
So what iPhone generation do you have? Do you have a 12 or a
12 Pro
13?
Max. No, 12 Pro Max.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, and I
Good.
guess another question is are you going to the 14?
Well, the one thing I don't do is I don't rush out and buy the latest generation because they have to work out the wrinkles. And I
Uh-huh.
usually wait 9 or 10 months, maybe even a year. Like I got the 13 in the middle of the summer, knowing that the 14 was coming out. And honestly, they say you can get a 35 something megabyte file, raw file out of the 14, but I think it gets composited to be able to export. So I'm just wondering how much longer they can tout that the megapixel file is larger and larger and larger without making the iPhone or whatever device is housing everything much larger. Something's going to have to give at some point.
Yeah, I heard it was 45 megabytes. Yeah,
Yeah.
no, I heard it was
It's a-
45 megabytes. But I was told not to upgrade to the 13 because I have a 12. Because she said there's no difference, you know.
Yeah.
I went from
Isn't
the,
it wonderful?
What was that again? I'm sorry.
oh, I was saying, I went from the 12 to the 14 and it's a huge difference in the camera.
How is it different?
The light management, the dark, taking pictures in the dark, and also the, like a lot finer color renditions and contrast. Yeah.
It's good to
Have you
You
know.
have the Pro or just the general iPhone 14?
The Pro Max.
Yeah, you need to go to the Pro to get many of the new features that they came
Yeah.
out with.
Yeah. The Pro Max.
The I always get the Pro because the Pro Max just feels like it's gone from a device that was designed to fit in your pocket to something that is now a small computer. So for me, the ease of having a smaller device to carry around is why I do the 12 Pro. I think the 12 Pro Max or whatever, the Pro Max is just an upgrade in size.
Have you used any lenses on your iPhone? Some auxiliary lenses?
I had them for a while because, of course, I had to try them. You have to try those. But for me, the iPhone is what it is because it is so versatile and accessible and easy to pack away and to put on a moment. I think I had Memento lenses, which are good glass.
Yeah.
It was just too much to carry around. The beauty for me is how good it is and how easy it is to have with me.
The iPhone 13
Okay.
better macro than the 12.
Can't hear.
I'm sorry, the 13 does better macro than the 12 itself, and I have the moment lenses and they're amazing. But you do have to take them on and off and you get used to using them. You know, depends on what you're looking for, but you can get really close with the regular, with the phone. That's true.
And you'll get incredible results.
Yes, I agree.
So am I looking at GoggleWorks?
That was GoggleWorks right
that-
there. Yeah.
Yeah, this is GoggleWorks. Yep. We don't have a big crowd here, but we have a good crowd online again. We're trying to encourage people to come to GoggleWorks to get a little. The weather is bad. Yeah. 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 But it was good. It was a good presentation because it was Zoom, and we had really good reception here. And I can see a lot of good faces out there, and I see good comments in the chat. So Julie, you've convinced me to upgrade my phone. Thanks.
Oh, good. What are you
Yeah,
gonna get?
And well, I have an old SE, so
Yeah.
That's what I have.
Anything I would get would be better than what I have, yes.
Okay, so Hanukkah's coming and
It's coming.
Christmas is coming, or you may be gonna have a birthday. Treat yourself because it's the best deal. Where else can you get a really good camera, a hard drive, a phone, and Wi-Fi capability? It's the best deal in town.
I just bought it. I just bought a new lens, so I blew that money. I think the phone does a really good job at taking photographs because I can't make a phone call on my phone. Yeah, I get terrible reception.
Yeah, no, they're most.
Oops, she can't hear you.
Most phone companies now are doing deals for the newer phones because they're getting rid of 3G. So if you have a really old phone, 4 and 5s are only around and they're giving away phones. So there's a reason to up, yes. It's.
If you're running a 7 or older, Apple's going to discontinue sometime, I think later on this fall, the ability to upgrade the iOS system. So you'll really be pressured if you have a 7 or older to upgrade. And if you're going to upgrade, it probably makes sense. You don't have to go straight to the 14, but I would recommend you get the 13 or the 14 because that's the latest technology.
I don't know what mine is.
It used to tell you, but I can't figure out what.
No, you wouldn't, there's nothing on it.
So I convinced one to upgrade their iPhone. Anybody else?
Yeah, this is a 12 Pro.
Okay, I'm going to show you how lame I am. I have an SE.
He's looking for a computer now. It says.
Yeah, that's for sure. My philosophy has always been, when you can't update the software anymore, that's when you.
Yeah. Yeah, we just had a comment, when you can't update the software anymore, that's when you update the hardware.
Like I said, you can get a 12 pretty cheap now because there's a 13 and 14.
See, this is a problem. You can't hear all the conversation going on here at Goggle Works, but everybody's telling me I have to upgrade now. Thanks.
I'll show you the pictures.
I know. All that artwork that's on my screen now. How many photographs do you take a week, Julie?
Well, I
Or a day?
I was organizing my Lightroom files for 2022 and I couldn't find any files that I had loaded for August. And then I went into my photos and realized I hadn't shot with my Olympus or my Fuji all of August. It was all iPhone. But I will say, this is a tangent. I have probably 30,000 photos up in the cloud on the iPhone, and those do not come into Lightroom unless I manually move them in because I don't want them populating on my catalog. But I think I see enough gray hairs in this population that I think it's important. I know, look at that. I think it's important that we begin to think about how we want to organize the cache of wonderful photographs that we've taken, how we're going to organize them and save them and leave them as a legacy. So your wife, your husband, your kids, your grandkids are not overwhelmed by the possibility of enjoying the photographs that you've taken years to create. And I think that's got to be another workshop or some sort of lecture, some sort of let's look at the possibilities.
Can
Yeah,
you
I
just, oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Can you just briefly touch on shared albums? I've never really utilized them, but I'm wondering, us as a photo club, and if we did something like going out and looking for items to photograph or something, that we could utilize that feature of shared albums. You know, I mean, don't go into depth, but just briefly touch what that means.
I've done shared albums with one of my kids, and you just include you probably include either the message information or the email, and then you just load those images into a shared, a named shared album. I suspect there's an app that we could all load that would be easier to just dump our images into that app, because I find the shared album with Apple a little cumbersome, but that could be I just don't use it that often. But that is something we could do, because it would give us the capability of sharing our images. Say we were out shooting for one day and we shared our 3 best. Because if you say 3, you'll get at least 7.
It's just that he mentioned earlier about how we weren't getting very much group participation in people doing things for the contests or something else. And maybe some people are intimidated by not having a good enough photo, or not, setting it up exactly the way it needs to be set up. Whereas a shared album could be something that they would just, hit the share button on your phone and put it in there, and everybody could see it, maybe make comments on it, give some suggestions and whatnot.
Yeah. Anybody's on Facebook can pop them up onto Facebook too, but yeah, but for competitions, it's more difficult because you don't want everybody to see your entry a lot of times. A lot of people don't. I don't care, but some people do.
So
Yeah.
one thing
Julie.
I have to share with you, because of my presenter notes being on my other computer, is we had a really good friend who did a 10-day bicycle trip in Norway. He's a photographer. He took his Nikon Z camera, his Ricoh, and his iPhone 13 Pro. Because he's a numbers guy, he came back and he ran statistics on which camera he used the most. And not surprising, he used his iPhone 13 Pro. And then of the 20, so I emailed him and I said, okay, you used your iPhone 13 the most because you're on a bicycle, but of the best shots that you edited out of the entire week, what the stats look like? Well, of his 22 favorites, 18 were with his iPhone.
Wow.
It says a lot about the device.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Yeah, my son does a lot of backpacking. He doesn't carry a phone. It's just this iPhone.
Right.
And that's all he needs. Yep.
Yeah.
And with the multiple lenses now they have the wide angle, they got the telephoto, they got the standard lens that covers a pretty wide range also. So
Sensor exposure.
Yeah, some of the comments here is it's more like a manual camera now too, because you have more control than the old iPhones. That was all. Go ahead, Julie.
The features in the camera itself. Remember Molly Isaacs, who talked about not doing global edits, not doing exposures and contrast, but you doing highlights, whites, shadows, and blacks. You can do that specific editing in camera with the later, newer iPhones. You don't have to go into Snapseed to do that kind of initial editing, but I'm not saying that Snapseed isn't a stellar editing device. It is.
Yeah. Yeah, that was always the photographer's problem. It wasn't a real camera.
Exactly.
And most people, you didn't have control over aperture and those kind of things in camera. Depth of field was too deep. But they've made it more of a camera and less of a phone.
There's a feature that I haven't heard mentioned tonight about iPhone or cell phone photography.
Go ahead, Dave.
And that is the GPS. I enjoy going later to my map. Whenever you're on any photo, you slide up, it gives you the EXIF data, and then it also gives a map if you have location turned on. And I can zoom over to Europe when I was in Germany or to California or wherever, and zoom in on an area and it says 48 photos taken here and 34 taken there. And you have a record, but also being able to remember where the photo was and share that perhaps with others on social media.
Yeah, I know a lot of cameras have that, but it's an add-on a lot of times, but it's right in your phone. Yeah,
Right.
the GPS. Mhm.
Oh yeah, my Nikon, you got to like buy another whole device and plug it in, and it eats up your battery more.
Yeah. How is the iPhone with astrophotography, things like that, stars? How's it handle that?
I haven't done anything like that, so I can't attest to that. I would think you'd get a lot of noise.
Okay.
You're gonna have to be shooting slow shutter and be open for a while. And I'm not so sure you aren't gonna get noise from that, but I have to say, I don't know.
Okay.
Anybody else done night photography with an iPhone? We could Google it.
It sounds like it's doing a lot better with low light than it used to.
Right, it does.
Yeah.
It will decide it needs a 2-second exposure, and it will take multiple images in that night
Exactly.
scene and then composite them and take the best and give you that night shot.
Okay. Julie, all this seems like cheating. All this technology, I mean,
That's the point, though. No one used, Ansel Adams didn't use.
Yeah.
use technology.
Ansel Adams would have used his iPhone if he had one, I know.
No, but he used smartphones, he used
Exactly,
technology at the
exactly,
time.
exactly.
But when you
Somebody-
consider the philosophy of photography is done first in seeing the image before you trip
Yes.
the shutter, then really the device is not as important as being able to see light and see the image and how you want to capture something.
Yep.
Seeing the image.
See it first, exactly. Yep. Yep.
That's the difference.
It's neat, all the creative options that you have now to create your image the way you want to in the camera. You can do that, of course, in the camera, and you can do it after your exposure. So like Julie touched on tonight, she touched on numerous techniques of creating photographs, and whether that's with an iPhone or with a standard camera, it's really, really nice, the world we live in today and all the creative options we have. What I don't like is, the artificial intelligence that automatically creates a photograph for you. That's not for me.
Yeah.
I want to be the artist. When it goes to the point where artificial intelligence is creating an image, no, that's not. Yeah.
Right.
I wake up in the morning.
Well, my problem is, Julie, now I'm down the rabbit hole and I'll never get out. Because
Oh,
this,
Have you chosen do you have an iPad? If you're gonna get a 13 Pro, you have to get an iPad.
oh, I have to get an iPad now too. Okay.
So the
But
beauty of the iPad is it's an iOS platform like your iPhone. So you do all the editing that you want with the apps that are on the iPad. But what you can also do with all your other bigger cameras is upload those images into the iPad and use the iOS systems to edit. And it works beautifully. If you want to come back after your trip and work on those images in Lightroom and Photoshop, that's fine too. But some of the apps that are on the iPad and the iOS system, we've got Lightroom and Photoshop on iOS now. So if you've got the laptop, go ahead and travel with that, but that's going to be OS, not iOS. And you're going to be limited by some of the apps that you can use.
Yeah.
And they're not touchscreen.
they're
Right.
still, yeah, right. Well, my screen's been touched so many times I have to clean it, but yeah, I have the laptop, so I have
We're all
Lightroom and
touched, right?
Photoshop, but not all the apps that you're talking about. Yeah.
I gave up with my.
Oh, so,
The only thing is sizing my images.
well, Julie, I know we're talking here and you can't hear us, so we're gonna shut down the recording. I think we already have. Jay,
No, it's still running.
okay, you want to shut down the recording?